Thank you. Thanks for coming out and hanging out with us. We've been having a really good visit. Josh's plane got in yesterday and we came over and had a quick visit with one of our creative writing majors. And then we drove around South St. Louis looking for uncrowded barbecue. And that took some doing, but we found some. And then this morning, we had a great visit with the topics in fiction class where we talked about setting and place and location in fiction and, you know, what else? Literary influences and um, uh, disembodied dog's feet and all kinds of crazy stuff. So, yeah. So we've had a good time, and I think y'all are going to have a good time here this afternoon. And I'm really glad you're here, Josh. So thanks for being here. First got to know Josh's work through his 2018 book, Acid West, which is a collection of essays about the wonders and weirdnesses of southern New Mexico, where Josh grew up. And it's a place that I don't think most Americans think very much about when they think about America. Even though lots of places have, or very few places have seen as many consequential events uh, as southern New Mexico has. And Josh's essays dig into several of these events, from the Manhattan Project to the space race to whatever really happened at Roswell, New Mexico. But they also depict beautifully daily life in a borderland, right? And not just the U.S.-Mexico border, but southern New Mexico seems to be a place that produces lots of borders, right? Geographical borders, sure, but also spiritual borders and moral and ethical borders and familial and historical borders. The American writer Barry Lopez talked about how important it was for a writer to have what he called a storied relationship to place. And readers of Acid West, which we have for sale today, following the reading, will know exactly what Lopez meant by that. Josh's first novel, The High Heaven, arrived last year, and it's so good, right, for lots of reasons. We see again that intimate attention to place, the landscapes of the novel. The people in this book are deep water, right? And the language of the novel shows Wheeler's ear, not just for the way his people talk, but for the sounds that America makes. And there's that word again, right? The word that encompasses so much of what I admire and love about the high heaven. Joshua Wheeler has written an ambitious, bracing, unapologetically big ass American book. Right? It takes into itself so much of our history, which is, of course, that nearly round Venn diagram of error and triumph and madness and glory and sin. It mixes and remixes its genres and its places and its styles. It takes unabashed pride in its literary and cultural influences. It's a book about American obsessions of many kinds, but mostly about, to my way of thinking, the American need to believe and the strange and terrible lengths that we'll go to hold on to the beliefs that we've chosen or that circumstances choose for us. It's a novel that leaves everything on the field, the way Annie Dillard describes things in The Writing Life. One of the few things I know about writing, Dillard says, is this: spend it all, shoot it, play it, lose it all, right away, every time. Do not hoard what seems good for a later place in the book or for another book. Give it all, give it now. You now, please give a warm welcome to Joshua. Yeah.
like talk like this.
The best part of the show is my facial expressions, which you want to get very close to. This also works to make sure that everybody's fully awake. I don't want you to fall asleep until you hear the sounds of my sonorous voice. No pre-sleeping. Thank you. I'm grateful to be here, regardless of whatever distance you're at from me. Murray has been very kind over the last day or so in showing me around. We've become very fast friends. When I got Murray's invitation to come here to Webster, I think I was in the midst of doing the book tour back in October, and I was feeling very much like I was done traveling and going to do stuff. But Murray included in the invitation that this was the Clewell visiting writing series. And I recognize that name because after I published Acid West, I got a letter in the mail at my mailbox on campus at LSU where I teach. And I'm not used to getting mail at campus. Usually it's junk. And so I had a stack of this mail that was sitting on my desk for maybe months before I finally looked at it. And when I finally looked at it, one of them seemed to be a letter that was hand addressed, and I opened it, and it was from David here at Webster. And he was writing to tell me how much he'd enjoyed reading my book and that he hoped that I would write him back. And I did write him back, and we began a kind of correspondence. He sent me his books, gave me lots of reading recommendations. A couple of times he even emailed me, which I hear was a big task for him, to get to a computer and actually use it. But at some point I stopped hearing from him, and I didn't realize what had happened when he passed. And it was probably not until 2021, late in 2021, where I was like, why haven't I heard from David? And maybe I even sent him an email. But yeah, when I heard that he passed, it was very sad, and it seemed to me very sudden because he was such a new friend to me. And I think that it's something that meant a lot to me at the time. I wasn't necessarily hearing from a lot of people about the book. And he was so kind, and he was so generous in his thoughts about it. And so it's a good lesson, I think, for me and maybe for all of us, that if there's a book that connects with you, reach out to that writer, let them know. I think that the writers always want to be able to get that kind of feedback. And I think it's good for us to say those kinds of things while we can. So I'm very grateful to be here, for many reasons, but that's one of them. Okay, I'm going to read to you a little bit, and I think I'll just start at the beginning of this book, The High Heaven, and read for a little bit. And then if I have a little bit of time, I'll skip to some other parts. But this is the prologue. I don't need to preface it with anything because it's the beginning. The prologue, 1948. Across the desert came the blast, and the ranch house shook. On the stove, cast irons jumped, and on the wall, framed pictures of dead horses rattled, and the hands of the noon-stuck clock jerked forward slightly and shuddered there. Lord have mercy. The Gentleys covered their bowls of beans as their adobe walls disintegrated more with each of the world's bad vibrations. Lunch and a rocket launch. Another day of Cold War in New Mexico. The blast's afterscream echoed to the border and back. When the dust in the kitchen settled, they went outside to squint against the sun, to look up and see what they could see. Oliver's daddy spotted the thing way off and high up over the missile range. He put his crooked finger to the sky. He poked the firmament and said, "Out there." It floated for a minute, quiet. A parachute deployed and streamed, but never fully opened, so the hunk of metal hurtled earthward, spinning wildly and flaming some. Young Jackson had beans on his face, and he kept saying, "Nazi." Oliver's son was not yet 2, but his granddaddy had taught him the whole range of cusses. The toddler liked saying Nazi best. Everything fired off on the missile range alongside their ranch got greeted with his daddy's hollered damnations of Nazis because most of the weapons were designed by one. Hitler's V-2 rockets and America's whole missile program now run by a Nazi scientist who our government cleansed of his sins so he could experiment with killing machines for the good guys. We beat them goddamn Nazis, Oliver's daddy would say. My own son whooped them Nazis just so we could bring them home to dream up space missiles all over my ranch. Toward the Twin Buttes, beyond the gypsum playa, cattle quit on their cud and herded up and moved off from where the sky was breaking. Oliver covered Jackson's ears for the explosion, but none came. There was no dust or smoke, no mushroom cloud. I guess it landed yonder, said Oliver as he rubbed the scar on his neck. Yup, maybe exactly yonder, said his daddy. Oliver kissed his wife and kissed his young son. Then he and his daddy tacked up and rode out toward whatever had come down now. Near Highway 54, they crossed the Army's recovery team, a fleet of jeeps crawling with GIs peering through binoculars, engineers scribbling on notepads, a couple of hound dogs rearing to get the scent. The soldiers yapped into radios, got frantic unfolding and refolding maps while steering through stirred-up cows. They seem a little more urgent than usual, said his daddy. The convoy hardly paused as the Gentleys passed by and rode on through the scrub of the Chihuahuan Desert on toward the Sacramento Mountains. They stopped just once at a cow tank. Way out here ain't ours, said Oliver. But when the horses were watered, they went on. Anything that landed on the ranch, even on the grazing leases, might get them a concession from the Army in exchange for giving it back or giving up the coordinates of it. Restitution for the aggravation of running cattle near missile range. No such remuneration would materialize if they collected rockets or bombs or parts of planes or any amount of dead ordnance from elsewhere. In fact, doing so was criminal. But anyway, Oliver's daddy tracked this one, whatever it was. They adjusted course, going one way and the other, not following any trail but the dim one in his head, driving the horses just plain mad as they cut through Creosote and Ocotillo, searched along the escarpment until the horizon got feverish with warnings of night. Then there it was, a crater like a grave. The hole was a few feet wide, deep enough so Oliver disappeared below the belt buckle when he scrambled down into it. At the bottom, a rocket. He yanked a shredded parachute off the mangled nose cone. Burnt fuel wafted sulfuric like rotten eggs. Oliver coughed at the sour reek of oil from shark liver lathered on the steel to give army hounds a scent. We better hurry up, said his daddy. And don't touch it too much. Do you want me to touch it or not? Hurry up and touch it some. And don't blow up neither. Oliver held his breath and untangled the parachute. His daddy crawled on down into the crater, too. They stood there with hats in hand, waving stink from their faces. You feel it? Said his daddy. Like something inside? No, I don't feel it. Sure you do. All right, I feel it then. Good. I got a bad feeling. From his saddlebag, Oliver took wire snips. There was no hatch on the rocket, and maybe that characterized the nature of whatever was inside. Had to be ripped out because it had been welded in. They cut around where an American flag was faded to charred stars. They cussed and pried, freed a whole section from thick rivets, and pulled. Yep, among the wires and transistors, tanks and gauges, in there with all the gizmo guts, a monkey. Fucking Nazi monkey, said his daddy. The monkey was strapped to a little chair. It couldn't slump, but seemed dead anyway. It wore goggles, lenses spider cracked. A camera was right in the monkey's face. The camera whirred. Almost like a nut job monkey, said his daddy. All the straps were like a straitjacket, and then the wires too, like some wrongfully convicted sucker sentenced to ride a rocket ship electric chair. His daddy pondered the scene so hard he had to crawl up out of the crater in sigh bunches and hang his hat on a yucca. A breeze came. Through spindly clouds peeked the moon over mountain tops. The horses got antsy about every bit of it. That's a monkey, said Oliver. I know when I see a monkey, son. Clearly we got a monkey. You ain't got to say monkey. There's nothing else to say. We just ain't figured the words yet. A gust rose. The Stetson flew off the yucca. His daddy cussed and picked the hat up and cussed more. With the hat, he swiped the air before him like to catch the cuss so he could swallow it and cuss it yet again, louder, which, once the Stetson was settled on his head, he did. Fuck, he said, God damn. Well, yank that monkey up out of there then. The little buckles wouldn't budge, so Oliver ripped the whole of the sad captain's chair from the rocket. His daddy clipped it to his saddle. The monkey hung limp down the horse's shoulder. In the distance, searchlights of jeeps, hound dogs barking. The moon was all there now, shining big and curious. God damn to hell and back, said his daddy. He slid into the crater one last time, snatched the camera, fumbled to switch it off, then crawled out and stuffed it low in the saddlebag. They rode home fast. Oliver hoped his wife was awake and willing to tell them the sensible thing to do now, but of course, she had already done the sensible thing and gone to bed with her boy. The two men sat there in a circle of porch light, bucket between them. A monkey laid low in it. They sipped whiskey. They spit at the hangfire moon. Oliver said, if there's one good reason for stuffing a monkey in a missile, there ain't. If it were ever meant for monkeys to fly, it ain't. There's dominions of land and air and all that. In the beginning, no sense intermingling dominions. God done laid it out his particular way. I just mean, why don't we catch up to the jeeps? Said Oliver. Give it up. I kind of got the creeps having it here. I bet it's worth more than we know, son. So say my guts, anyway. His daddy leaned over the bucket and reached in and undid some of the straps, pulled the goggles down around the monkey's neck. Might be plain evil to bury it in a jacket for crazies, said his daddy. It ain't ours. We can't just bury it. Yep, we better burn it. But you said it was worth something. His daddy held the limp monkey at arm's length, but sort of tenderly, as he unbuckled more straps. I don't mean cash. I think it means something. In the grand scheme, I got that feeling anyway, said his daddy. What feeling? Wonky, like in the grand scheme. And that's when the wrinkled eyelids flickered. The monkey gasped and coughed, then ripped its goggles off altogether. It shot from his daddy's hands, crawled onto his head, squatted there on his Stetson with eyes just exactly the wide size eyes get after resurrection. Oliver swiped at it but missed and slapped his daddy, who howled, then wielded the bucket wildly as the monkey hopped and swung around like reborn in a hellish jungle, but this was just New Mexico. They chased it all over the porch for a circus minute until finally they got the monkey trapped under the bucket, which his daddy sat atop, heaving and cussing and fumbling to light a cigarette. They must have drugged it like a damn elephant, said his daddy, but it's alive still. Or again. The monkey scratched, banged on the bucket's inside. Oliver stepped off the porch to catch his breath and wonder aloud into the night if things ever eased up. If all life everywhere wasn't also some experiment in the grand scheme gone awry and dragged home by rednecks. His daddy picked up the little chair from the rocket and tossed it to his son and said, I guess go lose this in the junk pile. And so he left his daddy hunched there, smoking anxiously atop the bucket. The monkey beneath howling high now and loud, but only for a moment longer, and then all was quiet as Oliver walked with the rocket chair into their junkyard, a shimmer in thickest moonshine. His daddy will die in a few years, all the bad feelings having gnawed him hollow. The weapons tests won't stop, and the ranch will end up encircled by the missile range. Oliver's little boy will grow and go to war in jungles far away. More scientists will come to this desert with plans for bombs and rockets, and there will be more monkeys too. A whole farm of space monkeys will come and go, and Oliver won't hardly talk about this first one, won't even tell his wife about his daddy back there probably strangling that poor monkey for God knows why. Every 19 years, the moon gets full again on the same day at the same place in the sky. Every 19 years, all the moon's phases line up against the constellations just the same as before. 19 years for things to come around to change in the same as they already changed. So it will be just exactly 19 years before Oliver ever tells this story. And when he does, it will be to an orphan child. And he'll tell that little girl just like this, the best he can remember. I don't know no way this helps, he'll say to the girl, but it all happened. And the brainwash book says, no lies. That's the prologue. I don't know if you saw the news, but we are going back to the moon. And this is where it all started, in New Mexico, blasting off some monkeys. This novel really tracks the whole evolution of NASA, from the earliest days of these experiments with monkeys, through the Apollo moonshot, through various moments in the space shuttle program in the 80s and 90s, all the way up to Artemis. So, you know, not to spoil the book for you, but it does follow this one character's life, from the ranch in New Mexico to the 2024 when she's a therapist for people who've lost the ability to see the moon. And that's coinciding in 2024 with, in New Orleans at the Michoud rocket factory, them building the Artemis rockets, which is really where they build them. So I was very interested in thinking about the reasons that we go to space, which, as the prologue suggests, have to do with war. This is very much a book about, I think, the trauma of war. There's a number of different characters who are veterans in the book. The main character's not, but she is getting through osmosis the kind of trauma of war. It's an interesting kind of trauma because it leads to things like, you know, the miracle of going to the moon. But it also leads to, obviously, lots of death and more war. But I just wanted to read to you a section from the end in New Orleans where there's a character who's thinking about the way in which history sort of layers on itself. So I'm skipping really the whole book to get to this end section. It's not really spoiling anything for you. I don't know that there's that much I need to set up for you, except the orphan girl that's mentioned at the end of the prologue is Izzy Gently, and she lives her whole life. And by the time we get to the end of the book here, she's in New Orleans. She's trying to help these people who can't see the moon learn to deal with their affliction. And she has a partner whose name is Eli, and he used to be a maintenance worker at the Michoud rocket factory, but was laid off by NASA. And they're now returning because the president has come to town to unveil the Artemis missions. So this is a little bit of the New Orleans section at the end. For the president's motorcade, the city blocked Chef Mentour Highway. But Eli knew every shortcut from his past life at Michoud Assembly Facility. He hopped a curb over train tracks and took Old Gentilly Road. Izzy sat shotgun holding tight. Chef Mentour means chief liar, said Eli, which is why they got it reserved for the president's big entrance. Eli cut through an alley to the horseshoe lot where crowds milled outside the razor wire perimeter of Michoud, gathered around the big brick smokestacks that, after all these years, Eli had not learned to hate any less. Centuries-old soot covered the smokestacks, soot from long before the spaceship factory, soot from even before Michoud made engines for tanks to win world wars, soot tattooed to the brick from way back when the place was a refinery for plantation sugarcane, soot from when enslaved children labored at big kettles on open furnaces, sweating mightily as they stirred cane juice to a boil because they weren't yet strong enough to break their backs like their parents did, harvesting stalks in the field or rolling heavy barrels of syrup to barges for a Frenchman whose name still adorned the place, Michoud, where now so many people labored around tanks not stirred for the colonizers' sugar, but welded for hydrogen to fuel a new colonization of the moon. Yes, thought Eli, those smokestacks were an abomination, still standing after all this time, flanking the rocket assembly building with its giant blue logo, NASA. Throw a rock in New Orleans and the suffering of centuries of slavery was evident even as the city slowly tore down Confederate memorials. Yet these plantation smokestacks still stood like they were part of our gateway to the stars, which they were, in a way, if you told the whole awful story. But nobody ever did, and that was the problem. Eli wished someone would tear the smokestacks down already. He parked and looked out on the 830 acres where, before Izzy, before a life of social work, he'd swept nearly 2 million square feet of floors in the manufacturing facilities and greased the massive doors and washed the black anodized shatterproof windows of the admin building, and even on his lunch break, tuned the many bicycles pedaled through the massive facility by engineers and scientists of all specialties. Did all this for just shy of 20 years before NASA cut him loose. Artemis Day brought crowds, various looky-loos, busloads of kids on field trips, space fanatics calibrating hobby telescopes for the night's partial lunar eclipse. Not yet the great eclipse. Anyway, a worm moon. There were protesters, like at any presidential visit, people against war, people against poverty, people against protesting. Like at any event in New Orleans, there were costumes, little astronauts and fairies and Chewbaccas, crews in drag and cowgirls and Elvi and the undead. At the perimeter, alien eaters gathered, sort of timidly circling each other in cliques still, gutter punks and young professionals and musicians and boomer tourists, all waiting to see if, when the drugs kicked in, they would meld gloriously into oneness. Eli recognized friends in the guard shack and went to them, hoping to catch up on old times, to see about getting passes to the ceremony. The moonless were set up between the smokestacks. They had a boil going with several big pots of crawfish and lots of beer. At least 100 people milled around with them, more of a party than a protest, even if they did have signs of their own. No moon, no lunacy. Open your eyes, nothing to see. No rock to colonize. One time the moon is a fairy tale. Fuck that moon. Izzy pushed through the crowd. Teeter was there at the center, sitting in the chair of lips, meditating toward an old television, the Predicta. She'd busted into other space again. God damn, Teeter, this time to drag a Noctalgia pod all the way out here, set it up under a tent like a sideshow. People sat quietly on the ground all around her, watched her intently as she peered into the Predicta. She was not naked now, but her hair was down and brushed for the first time Izzy had ever seen. It was so straight and flat and dark, longer than seemed possible. The glow of the Predicta's dim tubes was just barely visible in Teeter's eyes, and Izzy wondered which moon she watched. If it was streamed from Apache Point in the Sacramentos or some other observatory. Izzy wasn't mad at Teeter, wasn't mad about the crowd or the stolen stuff. She just needed a moment with Teeter to impress upon her the importance of not posting that podcast, not sharing it anymore in any way, because it was the story told wrong. There was no way for Teeter to know how it could mess things up. Izzy had carefully constructed a life atop the quicksand of her past. And if it all came rushing back, it would be bad not just for Izzy, but for the moonless, who still needed help, and for the moonless yet to come. There were parts of the story that Teeter did not know, but that was not her fault. Maybe Izzy could explain it all, and together they could find a way to tell the real story. Not of the rancher Gently's daughter, whoever the hell that was, but the story of Izzy all the way through to Teeter. Though she felt frantic as she pushed through the crowd, Izzy would not yell or plead. She would very calmly go to Teeter and ask for help. She stepped forward, and the crowd parted some. I'll stop there. Thank you. There's probably a lot of stuff in that last part that didn't make sense if you haven't read the book. But one of the things that's fun about writing is getting to a place where at the end you don't understand it unless you put in the time to learn all the lingo. But the alien eaters, this is a way for me to convince you to read the book. There's a new drug in the third section called Alien, and it's a psychedelic that people start taking that either makes them feel totally connected to everyone in the world, or feel that everyone is totally connected in the world and they're apart from it. And so you either have a really good trip or a really bad trip. So these alien eaters are running rampant around New Orleans during the third section. And the other thing is I mentioned the TVs, and one of the things Izzy does is she hooks these moonless up to TVs because she's convinced that they can't see the moon because they're separated from their homes. They've moved to New Orleans as transplants, and so she wants them to see the moon every night on TV as it looks from wherever they're from originally, wherever they were born. So it's all very complicated. You can tell as they're going here to see the Artemis rocket, everything's coming to a head. But it is many years after the original stuff in New Mexico. So we've got some time now if anybody has questions. Yes.
Flower accounts or the Pupfish, who are this Miami team that I actually looked them up because I wanted to get some gear.
Yeah, they're not around.
I have a friend who's an ichthyologist who studies
Oh, wow.
Pupfish, but their gear is terrible. So, so none of those guys are going to the majors. And so I guess I'm thinking, my question is twofold. If you could talk a little bit about why telling stories matter when we don't know whether or not they help. And how you sort of think about pushing yourself through writing when you're not sure what it's doing, or if it's, contributing to helping the world, or maybe it's not.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. And it's a question increasingly I ask myself. And I answer it differently at different times. I have lately gotten very obsessed with process, and I've talked to Murray about this a little bit over the last day, but I've become sort of like a self-help guru with my students, where I'm like, you write not because you're going to make something great, but because you're going to be a better person by the end of doing it, right? The only reason we don't take everything and give it to Chat GPT to make for us is because there's a possible that will be changed by the act of creation. And so increasingly that's useful for me, right? I'm like, do people read books anymore? I don't know. Like, do I really want people reading what I'm writing anyway? I don't know. It's scary to think about that, to put yourself out there is sort of vulnerable, but I do know that I want to get better as a person in the world. I want to get better at understanding the world I live in. I want to get better at understanding the stories of people around me. I want to get better at being able to communicate the things that I feel. And writing can help me with that, and not just generally, but when I engage in a project now, I think very specifically about ways that I want it to change me, you know? So it's not so much like, am I writing this because I think it can get into this magazine, or am I writing this because, I hope that it's going to lead to this outcome? It's like, in the process of writing this, am I going to learn how to be more emotionally available for my friends and my family? Or in the process of writing this, am I going to learn to care less about what kind of car I drive, or whatever issue? It is a lot like therapy or something. And I feel like I've been talking about this a lot, like in the last 6 months, and I feel like I'm starting to sound hokey, when I do it. But for me, it's become really useful. I think all great revelations are kind of cliche in a way. And I think for a long time, I was really focused on making a good product. And I don't know that that's the most useful way to approach it, especially if we're approaching an age where a machine can spit out a great product without a person. So that's one thing I've been thinking about a lot. But the other thing is just like, I think we write these stories and we tell these stories because there is something about the past that needs to be told differently, always. Right? The old saying is that the history is written by the victor. One of my favorite reviews of this book said it was a loser's history of America. And I was like, hell yeah. I want to tell the stories of the losers, you know? And I thought about that. I was like, like, not to knock on the great scientists and engineers who do great things with NASA. I think it's wonderful. But I saw stories of scientists and engineers and astronauts, and that did not reflect the experience of going to the moon of most Americans. For most Americans, it was an experience of hearing about it on the radio or seeing it on the TV, and then having to go back to, um, bring eggs to the table at the diner and wash the dishes. And I was interested in that. How does our perception of transcendence change when we're doing this great, amazing thing, but it's kind of out of our reach? Um, so yeah, telling the stories of the losers is, yeah. Um, the writer Harry Crews would not call them losers. He would say he liked to tell the stories of people with special considerations under God. Um, and I like that too. It's those are my people. Those are the people that I'm from, and they're the people that I think have the most to teach us about the world. So I probably didn't answer your question at all, but I rambled long enough for it to seem like an answer. Thank you. Yeah. Good question. I thought the tale would begin with Izzy in New Orleans in the present day, which is where it ends. I was telling the class this morning, I got interested in this therapist who her clients were people who'd been abducted by aliens. This is a real lady who I read about and then I met and was interviewing when I was writing Acid West. And I was like, oh, that's a great character. I'd love to write about her. Um, and I got kind of stuck trying to do it. And so I was like, oh, I got to figure out her backstory. And when I went back to the beginning, I ended up sort of telling the story of something that I heard about my family's ranch in New Mexico growing up, which was the story of this woman that left a cult, a UFO cult that was sort of disbanded in 1967 in New Mexico, and one of the women that was part of the cult ended up coming and staying with my family at their ranch, the White Sands Ranch. And that story had always kind of stuck with me. And when I was figuring out a backstory for Izzy, I was like, oh, that's her. So I gave her that backstory. And then I was like, the backstory is more interesting than the New Orleans stuff. So then I just started writing that. And I decided I'll do the easy thing. I'll tell her entire life, you know? And it ended up being a bigger undertaking than I thought it was going to be. But that's kind of where it started. The prologue, however, was not at the beginning of the book. This scene happened much later in the first part, and was kind of like a flashback. There's a part later, not to spoil it, but there's a part later where the film of the monkey that the dad gets in the prologue comes back. And that was there, and the finding of the film was just like a paragraph. And this is the one moment where the commercially tinged advice of my agent was incredibly useful, because she was like, take this, make it a prologue, and I can probably sell this novel. Because it has all the parts, it's like cowboy stuff, space stuff, New Mexico stuff. She's like, all of it's there. Monkeys, for sure. People love a monkey story. And she was like, it doesn't even have to stay a prologue. She was like, just do it so we can, because editors don't read whole books when they're thinking about acquiring them, They look at the first couple pages while they're having their 2 martini lunch or whatever. And she was like, give me a couple pages here and you can put it back in the book where it belongs. And she convinced me that I should do that. But like always, when I take on a task, I get obsessed with it, and, the OCD kicks in, and I was like, I'm going to make this great. And it actually changed the whole strategy for the book. I ended up taking all the flashbacks out. There was a lot of flashbacks, and I was like, I'm going to do it all chronologically. I'm going to start at the beginning and end at the end. And yeah, the prologue kind of took on a life of its own. And at one point, the prologue, it went from being a paragraph in the middle of section 1 to being like a 30-page prologue, to I just worked on getting it down, so that it became what it is, which is like 5 pages or something. But yeah, it seems dumb now, but like clearly it's the beginning of the story, but it wasn't at the beginning to begin with. Yeah, here and then here.
suppose you're going through someone's entire life, so there's gonna be characters that show up for a while, like Oliver at the beginning, in prologue, and they're like, oh, now you're focusing on new main characters, so you kind of like keep that organized as a writer.
Yeah, I think that the greatest organizational tool that you have is putting it in a book, right? So that you can always remember where stuff goes. But just technically, I'll tell you, I use a software called Scrivener, which is a fairly cheap thing. You do have to buy, but it's like 30 or 40 bucks. And it's not a full word processor like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, but it's geared more towards keeping track of giant projects. And there's lots of functionality where you can nest documents inside of other documents. You can create like character charts. You can create timelines. It's basically a way for me to keep myself engaged with the project while also procrastinating actually writing the project, right? It's just sort of like a playground where I can move note cards around. I can play with character names, and it does have a learning curve. It took me like 6 months to figure out how to learn to use Scrivener well. But once I figured it out, I was like, oh, this is great. Like, this book became as big and sprawling as it is because I had this tool to help me keep track of a lot of that stuff. So Scrivener's a great tool to use. So that's just like a technical piece of advice. Scrivener. Scrivener. Yeah. Right. And hopefully it's the company that makes it has kept it up to date over the years. It's not a very complicated software, but I'm always worried because famously John McPhee had a piece of software written for him like in the 80s when personal computers were sort of becoming popular, because he would make all these huge like note card outlines of everything that he wrote, and he wanted to do it on a computer. So this guy wrote him a program, but the guy like disappeared or died, and so John was never able to get the program updated for subsequent computers. So McPhee was working on this like absurd 1980s computer all the way up until the 2000s because the software that he knew how to use was only on that computer. So I do worry about Scrivener with that, but I've been using it for like 10 years now, and so far it's been fine. There's another program that I love. This is for a different task, but you don't have to have the software. The software I use is called Flow State, but it's only available for Mac. But a similar thing you can get on any computer. You just go to the website, themostdangerousapp.com. And it's a word processor where you set a time limit when you start, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 2 hours, and you start typing. And if you stop typing for more than 3 seconds at any point, it deletes everything you've written. And you can never get it back. But if you meet your time limit without pausing for 3 seconds, it saves it and you get it. So when I get stuck on something, I'm like, is this a 5-minute problem or a 20-minute problem? And I'm like, okay, I'm going to give it like 15 minutes in flow state. So I set the timer to 15 minutes and you just start going and you can't stop. Otherwise you lose it. Oh, countless. It happens all the time. It's usually when I get more ambitious and I'm like, oh, this is a big problem. I got to do 45 minutes. And 20 minutes in, I'm like, I got to pee. I got to look at this squirrel out the window, like, but it's a way to sort of, get yourself into like the app that I use, Flow State, to get yourself into that mode. And you write a lot of terrible stuff. 99% of the stuff that comes out in one of these sessions, awful. But every now and then you get this one little gem. You'd like physically, violently shake this one little gem out of your consciousness. And you're like, that's it. That's what I needed, right? The monkey's in a straitjacket. I didn't know that before, but now I know. And now I can write the whole scene. So Scrivener on the big architecture stuff, and Flow State or the most dangerous app on like, I got to figure out a small problem. And I need to just force myself to work it out. So those are my two. I do not get paid by either company to advertise their software, but it's useful to have tools. Cool. There was another way I was going to answer your question, but I can't remember now. Oh, there's a question here.
The down point thinking about, and the high tech, it does have some spoilers for the first part, is okay, right?
Spoil away.
It's like the possibility that either Oliver's dad didn't kill the monkey, or that he did and it came back somehow. So like how those elements of realism and like those more like things like potentials of resurrection and stuff like that, how do you have those interplay?
Well, I grew up in a very strict denomination of Christianity. So, you know, I definitely don't consider myself Christian anymore, but I grew up with stories of every Sunday I was drinking the blood of Christ and eating the flesh of Christ, and hearing stories of this is a man who came back from the dead, and hearing stories of, you know, virgins who were giving birth to children, and like, so this kind of fantastic stuff was just a part of my upbringing because of Christianity. So those kind of things are sort of easy for me to tell stories about because it feels natural. They were the kind of stories that I was raised with. Also in New Mexico, it's a very Hispanic and very Catholic culture. And I mean, like, I must have read this book, Bless Me Ultima by Rudolfo Anaya 30 times when I was growing up. And it's a book that sometimes is called magical realism, but Anaya wouldn't have considered himself that. And a lot of critics now don't sort of use that terminology, but it's basically a culture that believes in these, the existence of witches and witchcraft and traditional medicines that are outside the understanding of this Western science that we have. And so this stuff is very much embedded in the culture that I grew up in, both religiously and just culturally and regionally. So it's not a stretch for me to think about those things. The idea that there might be resurrection is possible in terms of Christian faith that the characters have and that I grew up with. But it's also possible in a world where, you know, they find this monkey in this rocket in 1947, which is 2 years after, in the exact same place they blew up an atomic bomb, right? And so once you have an atomic bomb blown up in your backyard, anything seems possible, right? Like why wouldn't they have the science to bring monkeys back to life if they can do that? So the combination of those two things makes it easy for me to write about this stuff, not as fantasy, but I think as realism. Like, I don't necessarily think that I'm writing fantasy, but sometimes when people read this book, they think of it as fantasy because there are some elements of that. But, you know, I meet people all the time who are like, let me tell you about the experience I had with an angel, or let me tell you about the demons that are haunting me. And I'm like, oh, I'm gonna take it at face value. If you say you see demons, then okay. And I think that's the way you got to do it. Yeah. Great.
Like you mentioned, like that you kind of enjoy the time travel, that like going outside kind of thing too. So I'm wondering how you sort of dissect what moments need to be short sentences and what sentences like which ones need to be long sentences, because a lot of times it's like a whole line could be like she began to call, she's dead now. And then some other lines are like whole chapters or like one really long sentence. So I was wondering how you sort of pick and choose.
Yeah. I don't necessarily know how I pick and choose, but you're right. You can modulate the reader's experience of time. So if you write a very long sentence that is kind of a run-on, that's not using a lot of punctuation, the reader's going to feel maybe a quick pace, but actually time is going to kind of slow down for them in a way because they're having to take in more information. And this is a thing that I'm not a neuroscientist, but from the neuroscience that I've read, this is the way that it works, right? When you're confronted with an anxiety or a fear, you naturally, biologically start processing more information because you have to figure out how to get away from the lion that's about to eat you, right? So you start taking in more information that normally your senses would sort of just be like, we don't need to process this, we're going to ignore it. And that's why when you're anxious, it feels like everything is overwhelming you, because it is. Your body's getting more information than it normally does. And you can do that to a reader too. the more information you sort of give to a reader, the slower the experience becomes because they have to slow down to read and comprehend. And but if you're giving them less information, they can move faster. You can process a lot of time. So if you say she coughed, she died, like that's less information, but you're able to cover more time because of that. But if you say she coughed and the cough came out slowly and there was bile that was yellow and the yellowishness of the bile smelled like, now time's moving slow because we're having to process more information. So once you have a basic understanding of that, then you can just manipulate your readers to the heart's content, which is what we all hope to be able to do. But in a book like this, yeah, that like there's places, especially in the middle, where a decade of Izzy's life goes by in like a sentence or two. And for me, that's always fun because I'm like, whoa, we'll fast forward through this and don't have to worry about getting it all on the page. But yeah, it's just something that you pay attention to and you practice and yeah. You mean like time of day or? Hmm. Um, time wise, I find that my brain pretty much shuts down after like 11 a.m. So I try to get it all done in the morning if I can. Okay, so Acid West, my first book when I was younger, I wrote Acid West almost entirely in my 20s and also almost entirely after midnight. That was biologically how I was set up then. This book, the novel, I wrote almost entirely in my 30s, my late 30s, and I wrote it all before 10 a.m., my life just changed in that way during that time. I will say, I live in a shotgun house in New Orleans, which means that it's long and narrow, and you have to walk through every room to. They call it a shotgun because you can stand at the front and shoot a shotgun, and it can go all the way through the house without hitting anything. But that means that over the course of the day, the sun starts in the back room, which is my kitchen, and it progressively moves forward in the house. Like each room gets sun at a different time of day. So I've got a desk in each room that I can sit at so I'm in the sun all day long if I want to write. So I move desks, and the desks are all at different heights too, so that I'm not always sitting in the same position. And they're not fancy desks; they're just places that I can set the laptop and work. So I like to be. I'm a desert rat. I like to be in the sun. Um, the sun is that is light that is carrying information from the cosmos that is important for us to download, right? If I can't download that information, I don't get much work done. I guess scientists call it vitamin D, but I call it vitamin download.
Got time for one more?
Just wonder about that imagery. She's kind of spiraling, spinning, and I think you have a lot of imagery of spinning, floating. I'm thinking about that related to my experience and how much you um, researched the cult experience for this. I mean, in that section, you say that her cult does not practice rituals. She doesn't understand um, why are they acting things out? So I just wondered if you could maybe talk a little.
Yeah, so the floating is terminology that comes from a book that I think I mentioned in the novel, Cracking Cults. Cracking Cults, I forget the subtitle, something about mind control. Both my grandfathers were preachers in the Church of Christ. I had one of my grandfathers preached at a church in St. Louis, Lloyd. And when Lloyd passed away, he was living in St. Paul, Minnesota at the time. But when he passed away, I went into his library in the basement, which was mostly Bibles and books about Jesus and church stuff. But there was this book there that was, I saw the spine, it said Cracking Colts. And it had like kind of an alien head that was cracked open on it. And I was like, oh, I gotta get that book. And I got that book and I opened it up. And all of the middles of the pages had been cut out so he could hide stuff in there. There was nothing in there at the moment, but it had been a hiding spot that he had made. And I became obsessed with this book. I was like, I don't know. And I was young. I was probably like 9 when I got this book, but I've kept it with me always and I still have it. I've hidden lots of stuff in it myself. But that's a real book. And that I eventually got a copy of it without the pages cut out. And that's the book that Oliver gets in the first part to try and help him deprogram Izzy. And that term floating is in that book. And it says that at any moment, a cult member might float back to their years in the cult and have a kind of flashback triggering trauma experience. And Oliver picks up on this because he's a veteran of World War II. And he has the experiences of being on an aircraft carrier and being attacked. And he realizes that he has these floating experiences too. So yeah, I researched it in that. I found this book that my grandpa had been hiding shit in. Use that terminology and that terminology kind of sticks, with it sticks in Izzy's mind, and she's thinking of it all the way through to New Orleans where she's working with people. But yeah, so the floating thing came from that. But yeah, I didn't go research cults. I think the cult stuff in this book is very tangential. I kind of like to say that this book is about the space between cults. I love cult stuff. I've watched all the cult documentaries on HBO, I'm a fanboy for the cults. The epigraph for the book is for the cult kids, the dedication. The epigraph is Shakespeare and Dolly Parton, but the dedication is for the cult kids. And yeah, but I think that a lot of books are like, oh, here's all the crazy sex rituals of the cult. And I was like, that's interesting to a point, but really I'm like, what happens after? Because that's my experience as somebody who grew up in a very strict, extreme religious situation, what do you do after when you suddenly have a belief system that's gone? The bad stuff and the abuse is gone, but also the stuff that you held dear is gone. Right. So yeah, I think the book was marketed a lot as about cults, and then people start reading it and they're like, there's no cults in this book. It's like, well, yeah, it's about the long echo of a cult. So anyway, I recommend that if you have something you need to hide, get a book that you don't think anybody's going to read and cut out the middles of all the pages. Thank y'all. Snacks over here. Eat that stuff, right? Out there for books. Buy those things, right? And